Hey folks, hope you're doing well today, and I have a question for you. Have you heard of the Bennington Triangle? If not, this name refers to this relatively large region in southwestern Vermont that many liken to the Bermuda Triangle because, well, people have a habit of going missing here. This is sort of hinted in the thumbnail where I call this region Vermont's Black Hole. There's a long storied history here of people going missing, or maybe falling prey to strange circumstances, much of which is condensed in a very small region around a place called Glastonbury Mountain. Now, many chalk this up to the thick woods around Bennington, Vermont. But let's be clear, the lack of an explanation for many of these cases often pushes some folks to assert that this place might be supernatural. Now, regarding that supernatural explanation, I really can't blame those that point this direction. These mountains are old, older than the first tree, and indigenous folklore, without hyperbole, does suggest that there are things in the mountain that predate humans that are more than capable of dispatching our kind. For instance, the native people told stories about boulders that swallowed people whole, of large creatures in the woods, and of course, about places where even the best hunters got hopelessly lost. Later, early Europeans would encounter these same things, and it wouldn't take them long to take this place very seriously as well. Nowadays, even though modern life has crept into the region, this place maintains its dark reputation, and because of that, today I'm going to tell you the full story of the Bennington Triangle, Vermont's Black Hole, ranging from its history and indigenous folklore to the string of disappearances in the 1940s that cemented this place in pop culture. If you watch this video in its entirety, I think you'll hear some facts about this place that you've never heard before, so stick with me to the end where we can draw some conclusions and decide if this place is really as paranormal as they say. Spoiler alert though, there's a lot of things that even armed with the facts, we can hardly explain. Anyways, real quick, I'm T, the host here, and welcome to T Storytime. If you like weird history, haunted places, and stories that generally make your skin crawl, but with an air of factualness thrown in, consider hitting like, commenting, and subscribing. It's a quick way to say, hey YouTube, this guy's alright. With that, grab your flashlight and your hiking boots. We're going into the woods today. Come with me, and let's explore this dark place. Before we dive into the modern lore, missing hikers, vanishing students, and people who supposedly vanished from their seats on a bus, I think it's only right to start with the people who were here first. Before this area was called Vermont, this land was home to the Abenaki and Algonquin tribes. According to legends, they already knew something was wrong with this place, especially in the area we now call Glastonbury Mountain. The Abenaki, in particular, believed this mountain was cursed. Not in the poetic, sacred kind of way, rather this land is very dangerous, and avoid it if you want to live kind of way. Even then, they told stories of skilled hunters who didn't heed these warnings, people who knew every ridge and every stream that vanished without a trace. Some say that's the fault of the erratic weather of the Green Mountains, but others, they're not so sure, because alongside the practical explanations came the folklore, stories of large hairy creatures stalking the woods, and other dangerous features. Now, as I mentioned before, among the list of things that'll send you 6 feet under in this region, one stands out. A legend of a stone that's hidden somewhere in the wilderness near Glastonbury. According to oral traditions, if you so much as touch this rock, you're done for. You vanish. Some say you're even removed from this plane of existence. Author Joseph Citro, the man who coined the term Bennington Triangle, actually wrote about this stone in the Vermont Monster Guide, referring to it as the man-eating stone of Glastonbury Mountain. Based on the stories he gathered from native legend, he suggested this was a large, flat rock, one that looked inviting even, the kind of rock you might climb on to rest, or lean against to eat your sad hiking trail birdseed granola. But the second you do, the solid surface would give way, like quicksand or maybe a trapdoor, and you fell in, like you just jumped into the water. And that's it. You don't have time to scream, there's no trace of you, you're just gone. Now, to be fair, let me throw this out before the history buffs pull a hamstring. This particular story only survives in second-hand accounts. Most of the written records supposedly come from colonists, repeating what they were supposedly told by indigenous people. So yes, it might be filtered. But filtered or not, there's a reason this tale has stuck around for hundreds of years. Because people keep going missing here, and strange things keep happening. Now, next, before we get into the 20th century disappearances that are best known in this region, let's talk about how this so-called Bennington Triangle even got its name. Another spoiler, like most places, it got its name from a rich guy with a pen. The Bennington in Bennington Triangle, and also its settlement by Europeans, traces back to one Benning Wentworth, a man whose name elicits images of a powdered wig and family coats of arms. At age 45, he was appointed the royal governor of the New Hampshire colony, and with that cushy title came a power colonial governors loved, the ability to hand out legal borders and create charters. As such, in 1761, Wentworth began drawing up land charters for what would eventually become Vermont, redrawing human history atop thousands of years of indigenous presence. Among those land grants was a swath of rugged terrain in the southwestern corner of future Vermont. Northeast of the town he conveniently named after himself, Bennington. That area, he called it Glastonbury. Personally, I like Aaron Mahnke's take on this. That name, it's magical. Legendary even. Now, to call Glastonbury a frontier city in the early 1800s is generous. It had fewer than 10 residents before the year 1800. Enough for a poker game if that had been invented, and not much else. There was hardly an economy too, and those that wanted to venture out this way had to come here by stagecoach, or by foot, the latter of which was the preferred option, as the folks coming here could hardly have been considered wealthy. That being said, some did venture out this way by stagecoach in the early 1800s, and during this time, we get what I think is the first bit of superstition told by colonists on this land, a story of some sort of monster living in the woods near Glastonbury. First off, cards on the table. There's no surviving primary record of this next story. No journal entry, no stagecoach manifest, no scribbled warnings in the margins of an old sermon, so take what follows with a grain of salt. Even so, this tale is one of the oldest legends to come out of the Bennington Triangle. Locals call this story the story of the Bennington Monster, a creature that's been described as everything from a Bigfoot variety to something worse, perhaps more ancient. Something that doesn't just stalk the woods, but defends them like the wood boogers of Shenandoah. The exact date which this occurred is shaky at best, but one reference I read pins it to 1813, well before Glastonbury even had a proper railroad. The story goes like this. It's a dark and stormy night, because of course it is, and a stagecoach full of passengers is making the trip between Bennington and Glastonbury. These were presumably the wealthier types, because anyone without deep pockets would have just walked the 10 miles through the woods from Bennington like the rest of us peasants. The horses pull the coach up a steep, muddy slope, but in classic Vermont fashion, the rain turns the dirt road into soup, and the coach gets stuck. The driver, lantern in hand, hops down to inspect the wheels, which he observes to be buried in mud, and that's when he sees something. Giant footprints in the mud, bare ones. No boots, no hoofprints, just enormous five-toed impressions. We're talking about Shaquille O'Neal stuff, size 19 minimum. Curious, he tracks the prints towards the tree line, and as he does, something hits the stagecoach hard. The passengers began to scream as the whole stagecoach tipped onto its side. The wood groaning, the horses panicking, and in the flickering lamplight they saw a creature as they evacuated the toppled carriage. A massive figure, taller than two grown men stacked on top of one another. It's drenched, covered in matted fur, and its eyes were shining, catching the light like a deer in the headlights. Whatever it was, it watched them for a moment, and as suddenly as it appeared, the creature turned and disappeared into the forest, never to be seen again. Now, look, could this all be local legend? Absolutely. Could it be the 1800s version of a bear standing upright in the right kind of light? Also absolutely. But the thing is, whether or not you believe it was Bigfoot, this sort of sighting does appear to be the sort of creature that might squeeze someone to death, something we'll see happen far too soon. Now, moving on from Bigfoot and back to some history, economically, things picked up slightly after the Civil War, with the town growing to about 100 people. Also, people started to realize something around the time the population grew. The nearby forests were thick with trees. This demanded sawmills, of course, and kilns, and soon Glastonbury was swimming in a lucrative charcoal production industry. By the late 1800s, Glastonbury's charcoal industry was booming enough to justify building a railroad. Of course, all of that prosperity didn't mean peace, and with this economic boon came the region's first human superstition, if you catch my drift. See, in the late 1800s, one of Glastonbury's sawmill workers, named Henry McDowell, got into an argument with a man named John Crowley, and ended it by beating Crowley with a rock. McDowell fled the state, but was eventually captured in Connecticut. And when asked why he did it, he blamed, I quote, "the voices in his head." This earned him a spot in Vermont's Waterbury State Hospital. Admittedly, this might have been a farcical explanation to save his own life, as accounts of this attack support that McDowell and Crowley actually had some sort of verbal altercation leading up to this attack. It didn't seem like it was unprovoked, but more like a crime of passion. This is where this sort of becomes a legend in its own right. See, Henry McDowell, while in this state asylum, Waterbury State Hospital, was well behaved, enough so that guards supposedly thought he could spend a little more time in the yard. Henry would begin doing just that, and one day, when the guards were a little too comfortable, the thought is that Henry hid inside of a coal cart, which was eventually removed from the property, most think. But all that's known is that Henry escaped, and he'd never be seen again. Local legend, of course, says that he returned to the Glastonbury Mountains and surrounding regions, subsisting in the woods. Even contemporary attacks, such as the attack on John Harbour in 1897, and events we'll talk more about soon, were blamed on Henry. And even some of the 1940s episodes are sometimes blamed on an older but still active Henry McDowell in folklore. Now, Glastonbury's troubles didn't stop at a fugitive after all. What's a cursed mountain without a little economic hubris? See, once the lumber trade had stripped the forests bare, and I mean bare, the town was left with empty forests, disused buildings, and a rail line that no longer had anything profitable to haul. But instead of packing it in, someone had a brilliant idea. And look, on paper, this idea almost made sense. They already had roads, structures, a cleared mountaintop, and best of all, a railroad that could deliver wealthy city dwellers straight to the doorstep of wilderness luxury. So in a flurry of optimism and, frankly, maybe desperation, they built it. A trolley line, a fancy hotel, and even a casino. For a brief shining moment in the late 1800s that lasted one single summer, Glastonbury was Vermont's version of Mountain Vegas. But here's the thing, any New Englander with half an ounce of common sense could have told them what was coming. You cut down an entire forest, and guess what you also take away? Its roots, the stuff that holds your precious mountain in place. So when the spring rain hits, and their oh-so-loved mud season came, nature cashed its check. Flooding hit hard. The railroad washed out, the tourist pipeline collapsed, and suddenly, nobody wanted to walk 10 miles just to gamble in the woods anymore. With no trees, no trains, and no tourists, Glastonbury folded fast. People packed up and left, and by 1937, the town was officially disincorporated, wiped off the map, a ghost town with a hotel no one stayed in, and a casino no one remembered losing money at. And honestly, it's one of the many moments in this mountain's history where you can't help but wonder if the land itself was trying to shrug people off, a place that devours economies, stories, and sometimes people. And we'll get to that last point now, as we start to cover the people that have gone missing in the mountains of Glastonbury. Now to start, many paint 1945's Middie Rivers disappearance as the first disappearance in the region that would go on to paint the area as the infamous Bennington Triangle. However, I would contend that the first incident to fit this mold was the strange passing of John Harbour in 1897. The story goes that it was October of 1897, the very first day of Vermont's hunting season that year. John Harbour, a 40-year-old man from nearby Woodford, was out in the woods at his deer camp in Bickford Hollow. From all accounts, John was well respected. He was a solid, reliable guy who knew these forests like the back of his hand. Despite this, that day he was hunting with his brother and a family friend. The three were together in the woods when suddenly a rifle shot rang out. John's brother and friend heard the shot. Then they heard John yell out, "I've been shot!" They, of course, started searching immediately, but it wasn't until the next morning, at around 11 a.m., that they found him. Something about what they found was off, though. John's legs were sticking out from underneath a cedar tree. His rifle was nearby, loaded and neatly placed, not just tossed down in a haste like someone panicked. But the rifle was just a little too far away from him, out of his reach. And even stranger, it seemed John wasn't where he'd been shot. It appeared he'd been moved. Moved after he passed away. To this day, no one knows exactly what happened to John Harbour, who shot him, why, and who or what moved his body. Now, if you research the Bennington Triangle, this is one of the first mysteries you'll come across that will lend this region a reputation as a place that swallows people up with little explanation. Next comes my favorite disappearance in the saga though, that of Carl Herrick. And I know that sounds morbid, but you'll see. I love this one because it's the story that makes me think something paranormal very well could be going on in these woods. Carl Herrick was a 37-year-old hunter, and he was hunting around West Townsend, sort of northeast of the most active portion of the so-called Bennington Triangle, about 8 miles or so from Glastonbury Mountain. Carl was hunting with his cousin Henry, and as you do when you're hunting, the two would separate to go about their hunting business. The thing is, though, that evening Henry would return to camp, and Carl would not. Henry waited a little bit, but after Carl remained missing at dusk, he'd contact the authorities, who would start looking for him, even rousing a search party. This search party, of course, would come across Carl, and sadly when they did, Carl was deceased. Now at this point there are no flags. There are any number of ways a hunter could pass away in the woods, from exposure and dehydration to brushes with local wildlife. However, when folks examined the scene, things stopped adding up. See, Carl's weapon was nearby, but he hadn't discharged it a single time. To me, this indicates there was no immediate danger, or that he was surprised by this immediate danger. And then there was the autopsy. See, it didn't say anything you'd expect. Rather, it essentially said that Carl had been squeezed to death, causing his ribs to puncture his lungs. Despite this, he essentially had no visible damage to him. Now, maybe he had a really weird run-in with a bear that liked to sit on people, repeatedly smashing him with its large posterior. Or maybe he fell from a tree, just right, and took a large impact. But given these events would usually leave definitive damage, evidence, or be virtually impossible, I'm lost for ways that someone could sustain damage consistent with being squeezed to death, or maybe a car crash, without maybe in fact being squeezed to death or being in a car crash. I'm not trying to be conspiratorial, but it's the sort of story that makes you wonder if that thing that attacked the stagecoach back in 1813 might have still been roaming around these woods. Next up, we move on to Middie Rivers, the first disappearance that almost everyone tosses into the canonical list of Bennington Triangle disappearances. To start, Middie was from a French-Canadian background, and he lived much of his life in Worcester, Mass., even marrying his wife there. But in the 1920s, he relocated to Bennington. Middie, throughout his life, largely worked blue-collar jobs, such as being a painter, a weaver, working in a shoe factory, and ultimately, his final job before he disappeared was in a printing factory here in Bennington. It's worth noting, last I mentioned, Glastonbury was a ghost town that had succumbed to the woods after they'd logged all of the region's trees. But by this time, in the mid-1940s, it had sort of shirked off this reputation of darkness, rather becoming known for recreational activity and immersion in nature. Perhaps it's only fitting that folks forgot how dark this place was right before the first canonical disappearance in this saga that would earn this place the title as the Bennington Triangle. Regarding Middie, he was really fit for a 74-year-old. He resided with Joe Luzon, his son-in-law, following his wife's passing about a decade prior, and they spent weekends at his hunting camp. Middie, by many accounts, would even occasionally act as a hunting guide, and he was intimately familiar with this portion of the woods where his son-in-law owned a camp. In terms of where this camp was, it was basically 5 miles east of modern-day Bennington along Route 9, at which point you'd head up the modern-day Harbour Road and follow it for 3 or 4 miles to Joe Luzon's hunting camp. Along the way, there were steep hills, hollows, creeks, swamps, and all the works. At this camp, you'd be close to the city of Woodford, so not totally isolated. But north from here, you'd get further and further away from civilization. This area was referred to as Bickford Hollow, which refers to the area in the canyon that the stream follows between these two mountains. Now, the actual story that sadly made Middie famous would begin on the weekend of November 10th, 1945. And this weekend, of course, Rivers and his son-in-law would attend the son-in-law's hunting camp as usual. The actual date of this incident was Monday, November 12th, a couple of days into the trip. And on this day, Rivers went hunting with a man named Hollis Armstrong, a fellow hunter. Hollis and him were initially separated, which again is normal when you're hunting, with Hollis being on a ridge opposite the hunting camp. This day was normal by all accounts, until 4 p.m. rolled around, and Hollis knew the sunset was on the way, so he started to head back to camp. On the way back, he actually ran into Rivers, who he queried, saying, basically, hey, you're going the wrong way, because Rivers was indeed heading away from their hunting camp, to which Rivers would essentially tell him he knew what he was doing before heading past him. Again, the direction opposite of camp, a decision that, to this day, nobody quite understands. Rivers, after this sighting, would never be seen again, though. As soon as Hollis got back to camp, upon realizing that Rivers had not yet made it back to camp, the crew would start searching for Middie Rivers. Now I should note, Rivers was well prepared in this circumstance. Digging through old newspaper reports, it's clear that Rivers was not only armed with a rifle and a hunting knife, but that he was wearing wool-lined pants, and generally was dressed more than appropriately to stay warm for a night in the wilderness, or maybe a few. That being said, the crew couldn't find him, and therefore they went to authorities pretty much immediately. The next day, they would round up individuals into town for a search, and even had the town fire department indicate the need for volunteers, something they did by making a signal indicated by the fire department's siren going off 3 times in a row. This search was being treated with quite a bit of urgency. Given Middie hadn't returned, they assumed he must have gotten hurt, maybe he sprained his ankle in the woods, maybe worse, and they roused up a group of guys by the end of the week to look for any evidence of Middie, perhaps a campfire or something. Ultimately, well over 100 individuals joined in the search, between soldiers from a nearby military base and Vermont's State Guard, individuals who were housed in a makeshift dorm in the Bennington Armory. Together, they'd search this narrow ravine they referred to as Bickford Hollow for days. Tensions reportedly even got so high that the women of Middie Rivers' family even went to a nearby psychic who reported to them that Middie was near a dilapidated shack in the woods, lost walking down a hill towards a creek, and that he grabbed his chest and collapsed near a tree. Of course, this advice never led to anything, but it did paint a grim picture of what they might have found, which isn't really helpful at all, I suppose. Again, they wouldn't find anything though, and over time, what was a search and a rescue mission became one for recovery, and eventually, given the falling snow on November 20th, just 8 days after he disappeared, and the winter weather, the search diminished altogether, and they all resigned to finding Middie in the spring thaw. The official hunt for Middie was called off. Now here, I should note that between the late 1800s and the 1940s, I kid you not a single individual went missing in this region without being found. People passed away in the mountains, yes, but they were always found. Because of this, people were sure, absolutely sure, that they were going to find Middie in the spring. The sad truth, though, is that Middie would never be found, and the only clue to his whereabouts ever seen again was insubstantial at best. See, while they wouldn't find Middie in the spring, they would at least find something. See, it was May of 1946, and funny enough, while searchers were out in the area actually looking for Middie's remains, it wasn't these searchers that found this clue. Rather, a woman hiking in Bickford Hollow would come across a blue handkerchief with stains on it, wrapping just 30 cents of change. She, of course, brought this handkerchief to the search party, and they quickly identified this rag as Middie's, given it was stained with a particular blue ink from Christmas wrapping paper that they were making in the Benmont paper factory that he worked at before he went missing. The searchers likely overlooked this handkerchief, by the way, because it was pretty much right next to the road. If Middie was indeed right there, where the handkerchief was, after getting lost, if he'd just gone slightly further south, I kid you not, he basically would have been in a neighborhood and he would have hit Route 9. He was also right there along a hiking path. And I think that's the most puzzling thing about this case to me, that it's possible that Middie, after getting lost, was incredibly close to Route 9 and on the Long Trail, a well-traveled road and path respectively, even in the 1940s. For a man of Rivers' skill, finding his way back to civilization from that spot should have been trivial. So how does someone get that close to the literal edge of safety? He was essentially in a neighborhood, as I said, and even if he didn't look in that direction for some stupid reason, he certainly could have seen the nearby Glastonbury Fire Tower from here. How do you have all of this going for you and still disappear, and then never get found? He probably, seriously, could have heard the hum of passing cars here, and this almost makes me wonder if Middie dropped this rag prior to going missing in the first place. Regardless, because this is all so unbelievable, people come up with quite a few theories. First, most non-conspiratorial theories essentially think that Rivers had a health issue. Maybe he had a heart attack. I too think that if the explanation is mundane, this is most likely the culprit. That being said, the handkerchief being essentially in a neighborhood, and Rivers not being found or exposing himself to the clear nearby neighbors points to something that feels kind of staged to me. It makes me wonder if Rivers was ever really here at all, or if someone put this handkerchief here. That, or if searchers just overlooked this handkerchief before the winter altogether, finding it later and thinking it was a sign of where Middie went after he disappeared rather than before. Perhaps in line with this was the leading notion at the time, that Middie might have been shot by other hunters in the area erroneously. This had happened a few years prior in Woodford, and this sort of incident was something fresh on the community's mind at the time. And to be realistic, it was a real danger, something that really could have happened. Personally, given the facts, I lead towards foul play. Regardless, despite searches going on through the summer of '46, nothing further was ever found of Middie. It's a strange story, not so much because he got lost, but because he managed to stay lost in an area that he should have had an easy job getting out of. That's to say, if it is that he indeed did get lost. Personally, as I said, I lean towards foul play on this one. Now, that concludes the story of Middie Rivers, and next we're going to discuss the tale of Paula Jean Welden, the best-known disappearance in the so-called Bennington Triangle, and among the best-known in all of New England. Before I start telling this story, though, I have a qualifier, and that's that this story's reality is pretty different from what you've probably heard from most sources. See, like many deeply disturbing stories without a satisfying ending, the story of Paula Jean Welden has morphed from a true recounting of events to a legend, with speculation sometimes being taken as fact, causing the whole saga to get deeply muddled. Because of this, every single detail I share with you here is going to be from primary sources. Every single one. And I think when you read only the factual details about this case, you'll come away with a very different opinion than if you hear most of the modern retellings. Alright, first let's talk about Paula. Paula herself was an 18-year-old Bennington College sophomore. She lived in Dewey Hall on campus while studying art. She was from Stamford, Connecticut, where she came from a moneyed family, which is to say rich as sin, with a father who was not just well-known, but actually pretty societally impactful, even to this day, as he was one of the folks involved in the development of the first generation of stainless steel cookware. Paula always had a good reputation. She was considered really bright. She was the oldest of her 4 siblings. And this event that we're going to talk about took place the weekend following Thanksgiving of 1946, during which she had decided to remain on campus rather than return home. Now, to modernize, this might seem like an odd choice, and this choice to stay home over Thanksgiving break has even spurred rumors I've seen floating around that Paula got into a fight with her father over a boy from her hometown that caused her to remain at school. But from what I can tell, this is just that, a rumor. In reality, if we view this through a historical lens and take in the facts, we might realize that we'd have made the same decision as Paula in this situation. See, students at Bennington College had Thursday off for Thanksgiving, but they actually had classes on Friday. Additionally, there were activities on Thanksgiving for students that stayed behind, including square dancing, which Paula was known to participate in on Thanksgiving. Some also say that during this period she was acting extremely sad in recent times. But there are verified accounts that as late as Saturday evening, after working her shift in the campus kitchen with her friends, she and her friends got in trouble because they were making a bunch of noise late at night after doing some variety of arm wrestling together in the dorms, presumably having a lot of fun doing it, laughing and such. I'm not saying she wasn't or couldn't have been depressed, but I'm saying she wasn't like despondent or anything the whole weekend. I will admit, however, there are reputable accounts that she had moments where she wasn't herself during this period. For instance, I read a primary source recounting that in the weeks prior to Paula's disappearance, she had overslept, missing class multiple times. This was not typical for her. I should note, there's a lot of speculation why this might have been, ranging from the shorter days in Vermont during winter to more serious mental health issues, but I didn't see any distinct reason during my search. This brings us to Sunday, December 1st of 1946. When Paula made an interesting choice. This day was largely uneventful early on. Paula worked her shift in the campus kitchen, as I said, and later began to study with some of her friends before essentially making the statement she was sick of studying and she was going for a hike. I should note, this was a woman that often did hike, usually with her friends, and one source I read speculated that it might have actually been a group plan to hike, and that everyone bailed on her. Also, to be clear, at this point in the story it's about 2 p.m., meaning that here in Vermont on December 1st, there are only a couple of hours of daylight remaining. Also, it was mentioned in previous notes about Paula that she had brought a flashlight on prior hiking trips she'd been on, though I have no clue if she brought this flashlight with her that evening. But if she did, I will admit, if she'd brought a flashlight, that would explain why she was comfortable hiking at night, apparently. Paula this night would put on a red parka, blue jeans, and thick-soled sneakers, as well as a golden wristwatch with a black band, not exactly rugged clothing, and she would head out for a walk in the woods. Many sources say that she mentioned to her roommate she was going on the long trail, but she did not. At this point, nobody quite knew where she was going. Paula may not have either. Another note here is that I read one primary source that said Paula invited at least one of her friends to go with her on this hike, though this friend declined due to homework and the cold weather. If this detail is true, in my eyes, this virtually rules out Paula taking her own life or trying to rendezvous with a man, angles that are commonly pushed, as if rendezvousing with a man is easily done when you're hitchhiking across town anyways. At this point, Paula would leave campus. Students, by the way, were supposed to sign out via a logbook if they were leaving overnight. She didn't do this. This suggests to me that Paula intended to return back later this evening. Paula also left with no substantial sum of money, and she left behind a check for a substantial amount of money, I think hundreds, that she'd been sent for living expenses. On her way to campus, two of her friends also drove by her and saw her leaving campus, and she saw them too, and she waved goodbye to them. My impression is this right here, when she waved goodbye to her friends that were leaving campus, is the actual last time people that could definitively identify her ever saw her. It's worth noting, all across comments sections, I've seen the sentiment that this act, going off on a hike with potentially little warning while ignoring the dangers of night hiking, was clearly an act of mental illness, but I'm inclined to disagree. I think this was just who she was, a spontaneous person. For instance, while reading through sources discussing Paula, I read that after her freshman year, she actually, sort of on a whim, decided to ride her bicycle home from Bennington to Stamford, Connecticut, rather than shipping her bicycle home. This is a distance of about 130 miles as the crow flies, and this is sizably longer along roadways. To accomplish this, she trained for weeks, riding long distances on her bicycle, and then she accomplished what she set out to do. She rode for multiple days, hundreds of miles, through the rain and everything, and actually did in fact get back to Stamford in one piece. Paula wasn't some spring daisy. She was tough, and she was committed, and she was also spontaneous. For now, though, Paula had left campus. Her friends would never see her again. Now let's quickly jump forward in time before discussing the breadcrumbs that lead us to some semblance of a conclusion. To start, alarm bells started ringing on Monday, December 2nd, the next day, when Paula's roommate woke up to discover Paula had not returned to her dorm. Her bed was empty, and given they had classes, it was clear that something was amiss. She pretty much immediately let the school officials know, and around noon on Monday, the admissions director, Mary Garrett, called State Attorney William Travers Jerome Jr., the county attorney, about the missing girl. Now, to be clear, some paint it as strange that the school would contact the county attorney before the police, but in reality this made sense. Back in the 1940s, you see, the county attorney in Vermont was essentially the top dog in law enforcement in the area. He was the sheriff's boss. It made perfect sense to go to him in this scenario when the school, with a reputation for keeping their many young women safe, had a serious problem on their hands that they wanted resolved quickly. Local efforts to find Paula were organized relatively immediately, and they had a clear goal. The first lead they went off of was that Paula's roommate remembered she'd mentioned she wanted to visit a spot called Everett Cave on Mount Anthony, a place only about 4 miles south as the crow flies. A man named Henry Steele of the local Fairdale Farms would take some students with him to search the area where this cave was, though this search didn't really yield anything. After this unsuccessful search, the school decided to drop its quiet approach and consult the media, who would make a radio broadcast regarding Paula Welden's disappearance on Monday evening, and by Tuesday morning, her disappearance and photo had been reported in print and posted all over the place in New England. Meanwhile, classes were dismissed at Bennington College, and many male students from the Massachusetts-based Williams College would venture the 20 miles north to form small groups and begin searching the area around Mount Anthony and McCullough Woods, other places that Paula had mentioned she wanted to hike. This is all despite the fact that when Paula's father was asked about whether she might have fallen for a boy at Williams College, her father referred to those boys as chums, which is a bit rude for a bunch of guys that just came out to help look for your daughter, but hey, I understand the situation was tense. While this was going on, other theories circled about. Of course, many thought Paula might have gotten hurt in the woods, and officials, I kid you not, this one hurts to say, thought she might have perhaps gotten amnesia. Because, yes, poor women, they get the slightest bit chilly or stressed, and then they get amnesia. Luckily, they don't seem to have settled on this as their conclusion. Next, we start a chain of credible sightings that do add up of Paula, and this starts on December 1st. This timeline begins at 2:45 p.m. with one Danny Fager, a gas station owner near the college, that said that around 2:45 p.m. on Sunday, he saw Paula run up and then down the side of a gravel pit near the college gates before sticking her thumb out by the road. presumably to hitchhike. FYI, today we think hitchhiking is dangerous, because it is. But back then, this was pretty much a common thing to do. It was well accepted, and a trusty way to get around that Paula had done with her friends and roommate previously. This was pretty typical behavior for her. Next, we meet a contractor who lived outside of Bennington. His name was Louis Knapp. This man saw Paula outside of Danny Fager's gas station, just past the campus gates along Route 67A, and he pulled over for her. He gave a ride to her, who he referred to as the hitchhiker, at about 3 p.m. She essentially asked him, "Where's the long trail located, and can you take me there?" To which he responded, "I can take you part of the way there, as far as my house that's on Route 9. He would also essentially perfectly describe Paula, including the color of her shoes, which is a detail that hadn't been reported up to this point. The only detail he got wrong was he thought her red parka was brown, but upon further inquiry, the police would discover that Louis Knapp was colorblind, and therefore he would have interpreted her red parka as brown, which to me makes him our first credible witness following her friends last seeing her. These two, Knapp and Paula Welden, would ride together to Lewis's home, which was right over the Furnace Bridge along Route 9 in Woodford, right about here on the map I'm showing you, about 2 miles from the Long Trail entrance. After being dropped off, she would get out and start walking up the road according to Lewis. This was at about 3:15 p.m., and this time is notable because Lewis's wife was mad that he was 15 minutes late to their Sunday dinner, which in their house apparently always occurred at 3 p.m. Therefore, the timing stood out to them. Lewis would apparently remark about this ride he'd given to his family when he went inside, and his daughter would run outside to see who he'd brought home just a few minutes after he arrived. His daughter would say she didn't see anybody on the nearby road when she went outside, though. Some take this to mean she maybe hitchhiked again, but personally, if you look at this map of the road, you can see it curves about 1,300 to 2,000 feet down the road, which, at a typical human walking pace, means in 4 or 5 minutes she'd have been out of view. Maybe less if she was obscured by features like trees or cars. I can't imagine the prying eyes of Lewis's daughter were necessarily thorough either. At this point, we have a fairly reasonable idea of Paula's next location too. At about 4 p.m., Paula would be seen walking up the Long Trail towards the woods, and given this was about 2 or 3 miles from Lewis's home and 45 minutes after Lewis arrived home, we can probably assume Paula simply walked the rest of the way up to this point. Keep in mind, this portion she's on now wasn't simply a trail. In modern day, this area is referred to as Harbour Road or Long Trail Road, and today it's simply a road with some cottages off of it. But back in the day, it was a neighborhood road with cottages and the actual Long Trail running parallel to it. This road runs north from its origin for about 1.7 miles before actually becoming the Long Trail nowadays, though. Sources indicate that on this road she was seen by multiple people, the most notable of which was a teenage boy who noticed her because he essentially thought that she was hot, and she was walking by and he just watched her for a while, because I guess that's what teenage boys do. Also, if this road sounds familiar, yes, this is also the road that, if you followed it, would have led to Middie Rivers' son-in-law's old hunting camp. I have to wonder if Middie Rivers' son-in-law was out there in the woods this day that this occurred. Next, lining up with this timeline, at around 4:15 p.m. on this day, a group of hikers claimed they saw Paula near the Bigford Hollow camp. I admittedly can't find exactly what this camp was or where it was, but I presume it was just prior to the start of the Long Trail in modern day, as this canyon she was essentially walking through along the Long Trail was referred to as Bigford Hollow. We've mentioned this already. She would actually ask this group whether the path she was hiking on was the Long Trail, to which they'd say yes, explaining it went all the way north to Canada, before explicitly cautioning her about hiking in the clothing she was wearing. She then also asked whether this trail went up to Glastonbury Mountain, which they'd also confirm. She didn't heed their warning though, because the last time they saw her, she was following a bridge onto the trail about an hour before sunset. This is the last known sighting of Paula Welden that matches the known timeline. Everything beyond this is speculation, but we will poke at some leads. First off, let's be clear. Though this was fall in New England, and yes, the ground would have been full of leaves that could obscure a trail, on one side of her would be a steep ridge going up a mountain, and on the other side would have been a creek that runs through Bigford Hollow. I don't think stepping off trail is that likely of an option because of that. There's also the point others have brought up that as you continue down this trail back in the day, you would have intersected this aforementioned creek, and there wouldn't have been a bridge. Paula in her right mind, likely wouldn't have crossed this bridge in sneakers. There was also an alternative trail, the Bald Mountain Trail in modern day, and this would have actually taken her west towards Bald Mountain's peak, before eventually leading back to Bennington, and I guess this would have made sense as an alternative. So this, in my mind, leaves us with three options. Number 1, Paula walks down the trail and gets to the creek and realizes she can't cross it. She then turns around. Reasonably, folks thought that if it were getting dark, she might have turned around, left the trail, and gone back to one of the roads. Number 2, Paula went up the Bald Mountain Trail, which loops towards Bennington. That being said, this trail was searched extensively by hundreds of individuals given this possibility, and searches yielded nothing. Number 3, Paula actually did cross the creek, getting her shoes wet in the process, and she continued towards Canada on the long trail, now wet. I think the former two are the most plausible options, and in both of these cases, you can assume she would have ended up along a roadway, where she could have been picked up by somebody. But in a case that hasn't been solved for nearly 80 years, who am I to say what's reasonable or plausible? At this point, it's worth noting there were some people, or groups of interest in this case, and I'll devote the rest of this section to describing possible indications of foul play, and leads that misdirected the search for Paula. First, there was a couple staying at a hiker shelter the night before Paula's disappearance, and the woman in this couple noted that there was a maroon Mercury or some other make of vehicle parked near the shelter. She actually saw this couple earlier in the day, at around 6 a.m., and noted the woman was blonde and wearing a red coat. This couple would be noted again later on December 1st, again the day Paula disappeared, because another woman's dog ran into the road in Bennington. This woman went into the road to fetch her dog to stop it from blocking traffic, and as she was doing so, she saw a man driving a maroon car with a young blonde woman in the passenger seat, who was again wearing a red coat. Now, I've seen a lot of folks point out this detail as intriguing, but to me, given this occurred during daylight hours and we're fairly certain that we know where Paula was until about 4:15 p.m., I don't think this was Paula by any stretch of the imagination. Rather, I would say this duo presents an opportunity for confusion and potentially explains some of the other sightings of a young blonde wearing a red coat, both in and outside of cars in the area around Bennington. There was also a cab driver who came forward, saying he'd given a girl matching Paula's description a ride to the local bus station. If this account were true, it meant Paula wasn't in the woods, but rather that she could have gone on one of the few buses that left on December 1st. These buses would have gone to Pittsfield, New York City, Albany, or Burlington. Again though, Paula left behind a bunch of money, and the cab driver wasn't sure Paula was actually the girl he gave a ride to after looking at her photo. So this lead basically tossed giant maybes all over the region while offering little in return. There was also a supposed sighting of Paula, sort of in line with the cab driver one, in Fall River, Massachusetts, where a waitress reported that a woman came into a restaurant, apparently under duress, with a drunk male counterpart. According to this waitress, the woman asked her where Bennington was. A lot of folks posit that this lead was never fully followed up on, but that's not true actually. Police, in addition to Paula's father, did follow up on this lead, and actually managed to track down this duo, and they met them. The woman was not Paula. There was also an interesting account from a couple who was driving down Route 9 on December 1st. This couple was going east from Bennington to Brattleboro on the eastern side of the state, and at one point they needed to pull over their car and put chains on their tires for traction due to snow. In the snow, they reported to see small footprints, and these footprints actually stopped on the road next to some tire tracks, as if someone had picked up someone here. Perhaps they were hitchhikers. The only issue with this theory, though, is that the car would have been going the wrong direction, away from Bennington and towards Brattleboro. Also, there was a weird sort of one-off occurrence where a cabin owner by the name of William Lauzon told investigators that 3 men, 2 sailors and a soldier, stopped in at his camp on the Long Trail and asked if he'd hold on to a suitcase for them. They claimed to be on their way further up the trail, but they weren't dressed for a winter hike. They never returned to retrieve their belongings either. Upon inspection of the suitcase, it contained various pieces of sailors' uniforms. Laundry marks on the uniform itself donned the name J.W. Carroll, and a navy hat and undershirt within the briefcase exhibited the names William Watts and M. Golder. Lauzon stated that Golder asserted he was from New York, and Watts said he was a native of Bennington. After further inquiry, though, it was discerned that at least Watts had been untruthful. Nobody by that name resided in Bennington. Paula's disappearance has never definitively been linked to this strange one-off occurrence, but it struck me as pretty weird that this happened. Finally, we get to a man that I personally think wasn't investigated enough. a man named Fred Gaudette. And frankly, I don't even think I need to tell you why I feel this way. All I need to do is give you the facts, and I don't think you'll feel any differently. To start, Fred didn't even live on this road from what I can tell. Rather, he was just here this day staying with his girlfriend and her kids. Many residents of this road were asked about their whereabouts and if they saw Paula on December 1st, and Fred initially claimed he wasn't even around this day. But when they talked to Fred's girlfriend, she made it clear that not only was Fred around, but he was actually driving up and down the road around the time when Paula might have disappeared. See, as this story goes, at some point on this day, Fred's girlfriend was talking to two men in a car out on the road, and Fred was watching her do this from inside of the home like a creep. During this conversation, Paula actually would walk by on the long trail. All four of these individuals noticed her: the two men, Fred, and Fred's girlfriend. Now, when the girlfriend would go inside, they would actually briefly talk about Paula, and then Fred would accuse his girlfriend of cheating on him, and they'd get into a fight that eventually sent Fred, later that night, driving off in his car down the road. Even more damning, by Fred's account, he was gone for just a few minutes. But later, by the account of his girlfriend, Fred was gone for hours. Also, this evidence gets even worse. See, in 1952, something interesting happened in Vermont. To start, John Hart, the acting attorney, had to leave the state for some sort of training, and in the interim, Reuben Levin was appointed as the state attorney general, during which he continued investigating the Paula Welden case, perhaps to, I quote, make noise, given he'd soon be running for state attorney. While he was the acting attorney, he'd dig up more tips about this case that pointed in the direction of Fred Gaudette. To start, a woman who had previously dated Fred Gaudette would make a deathbed confession saying, I quote, "My boyfriend murdered Paula Welden." Second, a man named Ike Smith was interviewed and would point out that on multiple occasions while intoxicated, Fred Gaudette would brag that he knew where Paula Welden was buried. Gaudette claimed that he was joking about this, which is macabre at best and incriminating at worst. Also, they'd actually inquire with Gaudette about those missing hours when he drove off from his girlfriend's home, and he had no answers. He claimed he didn't remember those hours at all, and I kid you not, it would come to light that the evening Paula Welden went missing, he somehow damaged his car driving into a tree? I don't know where this fits in, but it's definitely weird. Now, in response to all of this, Attorney Levin got a search warrant to look through some of the properties on the road where Gaudette lived, but just before execution of this warrant, the acting attorney's term ended, and they never executed these warrants, and they let Gaudette go free. Now, to be clear, this could have been by design, that Levin wanted to look good and make people question why the returning attorney wouldn't execute these warrants prior to an election. There may have been good reason not to execute them, but I can't tell you if this is for sure. Personally, I really wonder what would have happened if these were executed. Otherwise, details are sparse. Some folks, including Gaudette, were given a lie detector test in the spring, and they all passed. But as we know, these machines aren't really worth a turd anyhow. Also, it came to light that Paula's advisor at school was a real weirdo, and that he'd previously gotten kicked out of Middlebury College for some misconduct with female students. And later, at Bennington College, it was known that he sent female students love notes. But beyond this, there's really no evidence that he was up to no good. Notable too is that Paula's room, when searched, had bloody handkerchiefs inside of it, possibly pointing to some sort of sickness, though nobody really knew how to make heads or tails of this detail. Finally, there was sort of a southern twin to Paula, seen in Charleston, South Carolina, who bore an uncanny resemblance to her, including a scar on one of her knees. This woman went by a few names, one of which had the last name Welden, and the other that was actually the name of the Bennington College admissions advisor. This being said, Paula's mother would eventually talk to this woman, and became convinced, despite looking similar, that it wasn't Paula. It probably helped that she had a thick southern accent. There was also a skeleton found in the region in 1968, but it was determined to have been too old to have been Paula's, and ultimately it was found that this was a discarded cadaver that had been previously owned by a doctor that lived around where it was found. So in short, Paula kind of disappeared without a trace. I kid you not, of all of the evidence I just shared, not a drop of it was anything more than testimony. Heck, our entire timeline was built around eyewitness testimony, and had so much as one source been misguided or had another young blonde woman wearing similar clothing decided to go for a hike this day, we would be without a single lead in this entire case. Also, frankly, I'll give it to the police. They looked for a long time, and they sort of bent over backwards to find her whereabouts, even once reclassifying the case just to continue devoting man-hours to it. Despite this, in my eyes, while I personally suspect foul play rather than these supernatural explanations after hearing the facts, I don't think this case is clear. All I know is that she's been gone for about 80 years, and if she was really lost on the long trail, you'd think some trace of her would have shown up. Although I suppose you could say the same about Middie Rivers. Regardless, I'd love to know what you think, and I'm going to move on to our next strange tale, the disappearance of James E. Tedford, the story that actually got me interested in this string of cases in the so-called Bennington Triangle initially. The disappearance of Mr. Tedford is an interesting one. If you look up the details about it online, you're essentially told a story of a man who gets on a bus and mid-ride is suddenly found to no longer be in his seat, leaving behind all of his belongings, never to be seen again. This telling that you might hear on other shows, it's fascinating, and it's imbued with mystery, and it essentially tells of a spontaneous vanishing. It seriously got me excited to dig as deep as I could to find as many primary sources as I could, because from everything I'd previously read, I was basically convinced this story had to be supernatural. Anyways, like with Paula, let's dig into the facts and see where they lead us, beginning with who James Tedford was. To start, James Tedford was a 68-year-old man that was born in Concord, Vermont. He wasn't from a wealthy family like Paula Welden, and around when he was 18, there are records that he began to work as a sort of farm laborer for about a decade. A job where he would have gotten a bit of money, room and board, in exchange for some labor. There are records he worked on at least a couple of farms around this time, and this would have been around 1900 into the 1910s. In 1917, amid World War I, Tedford, as all able-bodied men had to, would have enlisted in his state's militia, Vermont's militia, and thus he registered for the draft. And there are records that he actually entered the service around September of 1918, which would have put him in the service very late in World War I, given World War I ended in November of that year. It's not entirely clear if he was shipped out to Europe to fight, though, but it's certainly possible he was. And if he was, he may have actually been involved in some pretty meaningful battles. Regardless, he did serve, and he was a veteran. Next, we know that in the 1920s he purchased a farm around Fletcher, Vermont, and married a woman named Pearl Mitchell, a woman that was considerably younger than him by about 30 or 40 years. We know that he continued to own his own farm because there are records that in the 1930s he and Pearl still lived on it. At this point, things seemed relatively boring for Tedford, even good, but the next update is where things clearly began to change. See, there's a note in a newspaper I found that states that in 1940, Tedford was a patient for a month in a veterans hospital in White River Junction, Vermont, for reasons that weren't mentioned. That's a pretty long stay. Then 5 years later, in 1945, he was actually arrested and jailed for, I quote, starving one of his horses. And remember, this was 1945. To get in trouble for this sort of thing, you had to do something pretty nasty. Also, I should note, his farm was horse-powered. If you're starving your horse in this situation, you are starving your means to an end. And this behavior is confusing to me, and it makes me wonder if Tedford, wasn't all there mentally. Regardless, following the horse incident, two key events would happen. First, in 1947, there's a record that Tedford and his wife sold their farm and moved into some sort of home together in the area. Then in 1948, Tedford was admitted to the Bennington, Vermont Service Home, a soldier's home, essentially an assisted living facility. Whatever was going on there, he needed more care than his wife could offer. Also, given he disappeared in 1949, this is about a year after these events took place, I can't help but think that his disappearance is intimately linked to whatever put him in this home. Regardless, now we arrive at the detail that this case is best known for, Tedford's travel home to the Burlington area, and his subsequent travel back to Bennington. From what I can tell, Tedford arrived in the Fletcher or Burlington area prior to Thanksgiving, and he spent some time there until December 1st, when he boarded a bus to return to the Bennington Soldiers' Home, but he never quite made it back. The first detail that stood out to me was that in the papers, the police would interview the brother-in-law of Tedford, and he would describe Tedford as essentially not wanting to go back to Bennington, which makes sense given he was from Burlington and his wife and family were there too. Despite this, with his family's urging, he got on a Clay Lines bus that would take him from St. Albans to Burlington, Vermont. He got to Burlington at around 2 p.m. Here, he would have a 4-hour layover, during which he ran into an old friend named Walter Limna, and they'd chat. Walter would describe Tedford as normal, not upset like he was described by his brother-in-law. Following this, he apparently got on this bus to Burlington, a detail the Vermont Transit Company was sure of. Perhaps there was a ticket that was punched or something similar. That puts him on the bus, about a 3-hour ride, and if it went as planned, he would have gotten to Bennington at around 9 p.m. But if you're familiar with this case, he didn't get there. Now, if you believe in the urban legends, this is because he vanished without a trace, leaving his belongings behind in his train seat. But this is probably not what happened. If you read the actual articles, you'll see that. See, while he wasn't on that bus at 9 p.m., there were breadcrumbs left behind about what happened to him. The most notable of which is that around 11 p.m. in Brandon, Vermont, about 3 stops south of Burlington on this bus route, a cab driver in Brandon saw a man, I quote, acting queerly, which means acting weird and just old-timey words. I don't get the impression Tedford was seen kissing dudes, but hey, if he was, who am I to judge? Regardless, he called the police, and the police didn't find anyone acting, I quote, queerly, as they put it. Later, they would describe Tedford to the cab driver, and the cab driver seemed to think it was realistic that it may have been Tedford. Another detail was the driver of the actual bus remembered someone getting off of the bus in Brandon that could have been Tedford. Also, as I mentioned, most sources claim that Tedford's belongings were left behind on the train, but this is simply made up. There are no references to personal belongings in any primary sources about this case. As far as the aftermath of his disappearance, sadly I couldn't find much of note besides the details I shared already. That is, except for one detail. See, some other residents at the soldiers' home were interviewed by police, and they said that when Tedford left, he mentioned he never plans to return. And that's essentially where the breadcrumbs end. Now, don't get me wrong. With all of these details in mind, Tedford most certainly did disappear. But to me, it doesn't appear he disappeared from the bus, at least. A more likely explanation seems to be that Tedford got off of the bus in Brandon, Vermont for some reason. Maybe he had enough and decided he wasn't going back to that soldier's home. Maybe he had to take a whiz. Maybe he had a mental breakdown. Whatever it was, it appears to me that Tedford likely got off here, or maybe that he got off on one of the other stops on the way to Bennington and declined to return back to the soldier's home because he disliked it there, and most likely he wanted to get back to his family and friends in Burlington. It doesn't seem to me like any notorious geometric shape got a hold of him, rather that he chose to go missing, or perhaps fell victim to his own deterioration. Next in line is the story of Paul Jepson, sometimes referred to as Buddy, a young boy that disappeared in 1950. This episode occurred on October 12th of 1950, a Thursday, and continues our theme of the fall being treacherous in the area around Glastonbury. Paul, in contrast to our other victims, was only about 8 years old. To be clear, he wasn't exactly a normal kid. Contemporary accounts by Paul's own father describe him as, I quote, mentally backwards, though his condition was a bit unusual. For instance, Paul was simply described by his father as having a, I quote, nervous condition, and, I quote, being a boy of 8 with the mind of a lad of 5. He was actually brought to Boston for treatment for this condition, but according to the doctors, it sounded like while his condition was gradually improving, it was likely permanent, and he never did end up attending school due to this condition. Whatever this condition was, it hardly impacted him earlier in the day, but later in the evening, he had more trouble. This apparently coincided with the other 2 times Paul actually just walked away from his family's home in the late afternoon. Without warning, he would just get up and walk away, disappearing into the brush. Now, on both of these other occasions, he apparently lost a shoe or a jacket along the way, which aided his family in finding him. And also, Paul was apparently headed distinctly in the direction of someone's home on these occasions. My impression is maybe someone he knew, although on one occasion, he made it as far as Hoosick Falls, which is about 8 miles as the crow flies. Honestly, a massive distance for the young boy to travel, probably at least 10 miles of walking or hitchhiking. Now, on this day in question, Paul's mother opted to leave Paul in the family pickup truck as she went to do her work. His parents, the father of which was a former school teacher, worked in the town dump, in addition to his father being the town tax collector, and they'd often go here and tend to pigs that they kept here. Every day, Jepson's parents would essentially move the 65 or so pigs that called the dump home between pens, and my reading indicates that they usually left Paul in the truck where he'd play, watch the nature around him, and so on. On this particular day, they recalled leaving him in the truck for about 15 to 30 minutes, at about 4 p.m., and when they returned, well, Paul wasn't there anymore. His mother initially searched the area on her own for 2 hours or so, and then immediately told authorities, who again searched high and low for their child in the immediate area, but they couldn't find him. Now here's where details I've seen online get murky. While the search for Paul begins quickly, it's worth noting this night was described as, I quote, rain-drenched, a factor we saw in Dennis Martin's disappearance in the Smoky Mountains, and a factor that certainly wouldn't aid in this boy being found. Additionally, it was getting cold fast, and I saw at least one report that Paul was dressed inadequately, wearing only blue overalls, a shirt, and a light jacket. Pair this with below freezing temperatures on Saturday, and things weren't looking good. Quickly, because of this, a search party was formed, and this included a New Hampshire sheriff who went so far as to bring in a bloodhound. This bloodhound, named Little Queenie, would pick up Paul's scent, but sadly would lose the trail at a crossroads at the intersection of East and Chapel. I quote, shortly up a logging road he lost the scent, which is characterized as being due to the trail being, I quote, obliterated by the rain, rather than the scent just ending for no reason. Some I've seen paint this as the boy having been picked up by someone or something in this area, but I didn't interpret it that way. Searches continued for a few more days. For instance, on Saturday, October 14th, 250 people would search for Paul all day until dusk. Most, admittedly, were convinced that the boy couldn't have survived the chilly temperatures and the rain of the 2 days after he disappeared. Even 2 airplanes joined the search, though. On the third day of the search, over 100 volunteers would hunt for Paul again, concentrating their search on the Brooklyn section of the town. Investigators wondered too if the boy had possibly hitchhiked out of the area, though I didn't see this speculation mentioned but a single time. There was also one lead around this time. Sunday after he disappeared, Miss Marcia Linnick of Jonesville told Vermont State Police she saw what she thought was an 8-year-old boy heading south towards the Vermont state line. She described him as wearing a faded red sweater, a shirt, and brown trousers. That being said, Paul's father said this didn't sound like his son, largely because the woman described that the young boy needed a haircut. Also, 2 patrolmen were sent to a farm 8 miles north of Bennington after a hunter reported to see, I quote, a small boy duck behind a barn, and nothing came of either of these things. Perhaps it didn't help that around this time too, another boy went missing in the woods around Bennington, having been noted to have survived overnight with an army blanket, an air gun, and 6 donuts. After this, further searches were conducted up the nearby Bald Mountain, where it was noted Paula may have been thought to have disappeared too. Fun fact, in the literature I've been reading, it actually seems that it was around this time when locals started to get suspicious about all of the local disappearances and a bit weary about those mountains again. Now, as far as what various folks thought happened, here are some prevailing opinions about Paul's whereabouts. To start, Paul's father in a later interview did say that he was unsatisfied with this boy went into the woods theory, and he thought foul play was involved. The police, conversely, thought the boy simply walked away from the truck, and that the rainy and cold weather eventually led poor Paul to suffer from exposure. Additionally, while the police were noted multiple times that they didn't suspect the family to have done anything wrong, there was a weird turn where Mr. Jepson and his wife decided they would only be questioned in the presence of an attorney after state police questioned his wife without anyone present. This apparently came out of the blue because they'd both been questioned individually before. Admittedly, it could have been the pressure of the situation, but reading this in an article stood out as strange to me. Also on this topic, I saw a document where it appears that Mr. and Miss Jepson also had a daughter named Marin, and that she taught swimming lessons with the Red Cross in the region at Lake Shaftesbury. She was 7 when Paul would have been 8, and there was no indication that she was ever anything other than well taken care of. Finally, there was also a fortune teller, I think the same one from the Middie Rivers disappearance, who said that Paul had been, I quote, snatched by a man from the truck that he was in. She also big-time whiffed and said he'd be found under a pile of leaves at the foot of the mountain. None of this, of course, ever came to fruition. Now, as for what all of this indicates, I'm not really sure. Perhaps someone abducted the young boy, or maybe a predator got a hold of him. Or in my opinion, most likely he wandered off into the woods. Now, it's kind of weird because Paul's father waffled a lot on this topic. Sometimes he said no way he went into the woods, and other times he went so far as to say, I quote, it was the lure of the mountains that pulled in his missing son, and that the young boy, I quote, talked of nothing but the mountain in the days before he disappeared. I gotta be honest, that's weirder than heck for an 8-year-old boy to say, but he clarified, saying, the only explanation I can give for his disappearance is that he was intrigued by the mountains and just decided to do a little exploring on his own. So I guess, ultimately, most folks settled on this angle. As for what I think about poor Paul Jepson, well, personally, I sadly have to agree with the speculation of the authorities. Paul had been known to wander off aimlessly, and this time, the conditions were just terrible for doing so. being rainy and cold. Also, given the way they described Paul's condition, I'm not entirely sure he would have needed a reason to leave or a destination to go towards. Furthermore, there's plenty more non-paranormal happenstance that could have occurred to poor Paul, ranging from abduction to the fact that he was last seen at a dump filled with pigs, which are known to engage in some, let's say, less than selective eating practices. Also, his father, again, was recently elected the town tax collector, which, given I recently had to pay estimated taxes, I can reasonably understand may have put the man and his son in some danger. This is just a bad joke, I promise. I love kids, and even if you are a tax collector, I think your son deserves a safe and fulfilling life, even if I'm not so sure about you. Additionally, some posit that Paul's disappearance maybe wasn't investigated as well as it could have been, because it could have been crowded out by the disappearance of our final canonical victim, Frieda Langer, a woman who vanished about 16 days after Paul, just about 14 miles from where Jepson had been. Frieda, you see, was a 53-year-old woman who lived in the area. She was spending the weekend at her husband's hunting camp, and around when she went missing, she was actually hiking with her cousin, Herbert Elsner, just before sunset. The area they were in was around the Somerset Reservoir and Glastonbury Mountain. Frieda had hiked here quite a bit previously and was reported by most to be an experienced hiker. Some even referred to her as a survivalist. Now, along the way, as she was hiking, she ended up getting wet after slipping into a stream. Again, this would have been in late October, and hiking wet this time of the year, especially after sunset, could have been very cold, a big no-no. Because of this, she made the logical choice of heading back to camp to change her clothing, where her husband was at. He stayed behind because he'd recently hurt his knee. Regardless, she'd never make it back to camp. Eventually, her cousin Herbert would make it back to camp, and he and Frieda's husband would realize that Frieda did not make it back at this point. Quickly, they roused a search party and even managed to get help from helicopters lent by the U.S. Army in Massachusetts and the Connecticut Coast Guard, as well as 400 individuals ranging from volunteers to the National Guard. In the end, sadly, they would not find Frieda, though 6 months later, sadly, or perhaps happily, I don't know, her body would turn up. This would therefore be the only canonical Bennington Triangle disappearance where a body was found. She was found about 3 miles away inside of the Somerset Reservoir. She had decayed quite a bit, and no cause for her passing was determined. Admittedly, in regards to this case, I know it's a lot briefer than the rest, but I have to agree with the bulk of folks that have done reading about it. I personally think she probably just got lost on the trail because she was hiking at dusk with minimal light, or maybe she tried to do something like take a shortcut back to camp and managed to get turned around. Admittedly, her body being found in a reservoir lends itself to this sort of outcome. For someone described as a skilled hiker and survivalist, hiking 3.5 miles would have been easy, but falling into a body of water like the reservoir still would have been just as deadly during this time of the year, when those water temperatures would have been well below the threshold to induce hypothermia. So, in the past hour or so, we've discussed everything from indigenous stories of man-eating rocks to Bigfoot to a range of disappearances that occurred 70 to 80 years ago, all of which I'd previously had described to me as bordering on paranormal. The thing is, though, as you're now probably aware, as you dive into the facts regarding these cases, they remain mysterious, but exhibit the potential for far more grounded conclusions. Don't get me wrong, I still love the stories of the Bennington Monster and man-eating rock, but when you hear these unsolved mysteries of modern people going missing, you start to wonder if something far less nefarious and more grounded is going on. Because of this, I'll briefly take off my tea storytime hat and pretend to be Kyle Hates Hiking, and explain, at least in my humble opinion, what I think happened to these poor people that went missing in this proverbial triangle, because, for the most part, the more I learned, the less I think anything particularly spooky was happening in the first place. I'll go down this list in the order I covered them. First and foremost, again, I know that John Harbour is scarcely even considered among the canonical victims of the Bennington Triangle, but in the event you'd like to hear my take on him, I don't think this case presents anything but a tragic event where a hunter was shot by another hunter, who possibly tried to hide the evidence by making it look like an accidental shooting by John on John. I mean, it was the first day of hunting season in 1897, we heard a gunshot. We heard John yell, "I've been shot." And most damning, John was found, quote-unquote, arranged in a way that appeared to be unnatural to those that found him. I don't think I'll get much pushback on this one. As far as I'm aware, most Bigfoot-related homicides I've read about, of which there are very, very few, don't end with Bigfoot staging a murder. Regarding Carol Herrick, I think you'll be pleasantly surprised to hear that I think this story is the best candidate for being supernatural in nature. Don't get me wrong, his injuries can easily occur naturally, but generally this sort of injury, being affected by a force so strong that your ribs puncture your lungs, leading to you appearing to have been squeezed to death, generally comes with evidence like signs from one falling from a tree, or more likely a car accident. Now, as far as I'm aware, nobody found a car in the forest that day, and it didn't appear he'd fallen from a tree. That being said, my best logical guess is that Carol did in fact fall from a tree, or I guess that Bigfoot gave him a hug, or maybe a bear sat on him, which, frankly, I think these latter two feel similarly plausible. In short, I'm not exactly sure what happened to Carol. If he'd fallen from a tree, it stands to reason there would have been some evidence of this, and the other two candidates, or weird things that could puncture your lungs in the woods, those are pretty unique. Next, regarding Middie Rivers, I'm again pretty puzzled, and personally I have to lean towards foul play. I mean, Middie was a skilled outdoorsman who knew the area very well, and even if he simply did get lost, he was both armed and capable of obtaining food, was in an area with abundant water sources, and he was dressed to survive the nighttime temperatures in the region. Also again, this didn't happen last summer. It's been over 80 years since Middie disappeared without a single trace of him being found. Also, I say without a single trace of him because I'm incredibly skeptical about the timing of that handkerchief being dropped. To start, the search party in the area clearly missed the handkerchief once. Who's to say it wasn't missed in prior searches too? Maybe he dropped it there before he started hiking, given he was in the area before he began his hike to the hunting camp. Furthermore, even if it was placed there later, it would have been difficult to convince me that he made it to that area, what is essentially a neighborhood, and was unable to find his way to safety. So my take is that this was placed there by someone else. Perhaps a hunter that shot him, perhaps someone who did away with him for other reasons. My thought is that if something natural happened to Middie Rivers, we would have found more than this, probably a body even. I'm talking really doubtful this wasn't foul play. Now, in the case of Paula Welden, I'm less certain, and dare I say I'm skeptical of how much we actually know. If you'll note, my whole timeline of her relatively well-accepted whereabouts is based on testimony of an unnamed young woman in the area being observed making her way to the Long Trail. If even one of those sightings was of another blonde wearing a red coat, our timeline entirely blows up, and we're left without a conclusion. That being said, I feel this timeline is relatively robust, and the accounts by witnesses are relatively reliable, which leaves us with two options, that Paula continued north on the Long Trail towards Canada or began returning home. To me, despite what others say, the facts don't seem to suggest that Paula was ready to leave this world behind, nor that she had even intended anything other than returning home that evening. Therefore, I think it's likely she turned back towards home, and perhaps met an end by foul play, perhaps at the hands of a certain someone that we talked quite a bit about earlier in the video. Moving on to Tedford. This was the most surprising case to me in terms of how I felt before going into it and after I got into it. Before doing abundant research, I was genuinely confused as to how this was anything other than paranormal. But after you characterize Tedford and realize he absolutely wanted nothing more than to get off that bus, you realize how likely it is that he did in fact get off of that bus. To me, it seems he decided that he'd rather end up lost and alone than back at that soldier's home, and sadly, that very well may be what happened to him in the end. Also, not to sound bitter, but it's pretty frustrating to me how little this shows that folks have read deeper into this case. Heck, just a week or two ago, for instance, a 2-hour-long podcast was uploaded to YouTube where 3 grown men with beards simply give a cursory explanation of the Tedford disappearance and conclude, I quote, "Wow, that's crazy. This is a good example of stories that make you have to expand your paradigm. You have to be open to more options." And then they just barely recount that Tedford might have gotten off the bus in Burlington to speak to his friend, acting as if this was a possibility when it is stated as fact in most documents pertaining to this case. 3 grown men with beards in a room, and none of them bothered to do any research. Okay, sorry, I'm done. It just frustrates me. Next, Paul Jepson is sort of in the bucket of Tedford. I watched a handful of videos and podcasts about his disappearance in my research, and I don't think I heard it once mentioned that it was raining for 2 days straight following Paul's disappearance. I hate to say it, I'm just skeptical that there was anything paranormal about this because Paul was known to run away before. Paul was disabled, and Paul had apparently spoken recently of running off into the mountains. Pair the combination of these three variables together with some unforeseen rain and cold temperatures, and that's all you need for poor Paul to go missing in the woods. Now, I must echo my sentiment that I'm not entirely sure why Paul was never found. Maybe that does hint at predation or abduction or possibly something supernatural, but sadly all of the pieces to this puzzle were there for Paul to disappear without mysteriously evaporating into thin air. Frieda Langer, I also believe, is a relatively straightforward case. Sadly, I think that Paula got wet, got cold, and perhaps in desperation to get back to camp quickly, might have gotten lost trying to take a shortcut, got turned around, and managed to fall into the nearby Somerset Reservoir. I sadly think it's as simple as that. Not to cast it off, but in this case, given they found a body and the cause of death would have been pretty straightforward, I could believe it. So that's that. Now, let me be clear. I do, as a whole, find it really odd that all of these missing persons cases and deaths happened so close together, especially in the case of the 6 canonical disappearances. And that, taken as an aggregate, does make me wonder if there's something more at play here. It makes me wonder if, despite my individual conclusions, foul play could have had something to do with at least the Frieda Langer, Paul Jepson, Paula Welden, and Middie Rivers cases. Those 4 in particular are strange in that 3 of them have no body to speak of and occurred in approximately the same place. And the 4th, Frieda Langer, would show up in a reservoir, but subsequently would apparently have no cause of death investigated beyond the assumption that she just drowned in the reservoir, which I'll admit is pretty reasonable. This is just a side note, but a side note worth mentioning. In short, I'm wondering if these deaths and disappearances are connected. So to be brief, paranormal or not, the Bennington Triangle is certainly a notable place, and as time passes, I would be blown away if we don't get answers to at least one of these cases. To me, though these events were sad, the fact that they all remain mysteries means that in time, given their prominence in pop culture, I still bet at least one of them will be solved. Perhaps in my lifetime, I'll be able to make a follow-up video to this as Old Man T's Storytime, detailing what exactly happened to these lost individuals. Regardless, let me know, what do you think happened to these people? Was it Sasquatch, foul play, aliens, or simply a case of the woods being much more treacherous than usual these years? Whatever it is, let me know in the comments below, and don't you ever forget, it's always story time.